The earliest theaters in Toronto were little more than empty rooms, perhaps over a tavern or in an old carpentry shop. We know very little about the men who labored in these theaters, but the work would have been occasional at best, and the wages low or non-existent. The growth of theater paralleled the boom in railroad construction, and by 1890 this growth had resulted in dozens of new and larger houses with bigger and more sophisticated shows. By the late 19th century, the booming population of Toronto was experiencing new inventions such as electric streetcars and telephones, but in theaters, gas lighting and the traditional forms of theatrical machinery were still the standard. Thomas A. Scott was the gas engineer who lit the stage at the Grand Opera House. He kept a detailed record of his 30-year working career. Although Scott loved his work, safety hazards were numerous and no form of sickness or injury insurance was in place. In 1879, following a performance of Macbeth, the Grand Opera House burned down. Thomas Scott narrowly escaped death by sliding down a peaked roof. The stage carpenter, Robert Wright, who lived in an apartment over the theater, died in the blaze, along with his wife and young daughter. Tragic incidents like this led Toronto stagehands to form a chapter of the Theatrical Mechanical Association. But this was a benevolent, protective society, not a union. Dealing with the powerful business barons who controlled the theaters would require strength.
Certainly one of the major trends through the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, 1900 is the construction of these large producing companies, these huge circuits that are controlled in New York and other places with ruthless power and tremendous exploitation of all the people that worked for the Schuberts or the Frohmans or whoever owned that circuit.
In 1894, the crews of Toronto theaters organized to form the Toronto Stage Employees Union. But no employer would sign a contract. The union's executive targeted well-known impresario Ambrose Small and called a strike against Small's Grand Opera House. The press roundly condemned the walkout. But the men stood firm. After only 4 days, Small relented. The new local had won a contract that soon applied to all the major theaters in Toronto. The first standardized rate card was put into effect, but perhaps more importantly, the brothers had won recognition and respect. Another victory followed. Locals from Montreal, Winnipeg, and Toronto were finally issued charters by the New York-based National Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. The TSEU became Local 58 of the Alliance, and in 1902, the term national was changed to international. By 1913, the membership numbered 89, and Local 58 had contracts with most of the theaters in Toronto. Business was good. As more people found jobs in the city, the entertainment business grew. The age of the vaudeville palace had begun. Designed by the finest theater architects and built with the most expensive materials, the great vaudeville houses recalled the grand opera halls of Europe. Here, ordinary people could enjoy a live show in luxurious surroundings. A typical vaudeville bill had a half-dozen live acts mixed with 5 moving picture reels. The cycle was repeated for 12 hours a day, 6 days of the week, and every week began with a fresh bill. Anything that was entertaining was called vaudeville. Reuben Elliott, an old stagehand, recalled vaudeville this way. The one thing we used to have in those musicals were swell chorus girls, mostly from the Winter Garden. Oh, my goodness gracious, but they were fine-looking girls. Backstage, things were also changing. A big-time vaudeville show required a 5 or 6 man running crew, which created more jobs. Stage electricians installed fixtures in footlights, overhead borders, and booms mounted in the wings. Knife switch resistance dimmers allowed operators to respond to the fast pace of vaudeville. Fly rails with high grids gave the flymen better ways to store and move scenery or backdrops. The operation of a hemp house didn't change much for 50 years.
And if we had anything heavy, once we got the piece in trim, like the lines tight enough that it was in trim, then they used to get the guys to run up to the second fly floor and dive on. And they'd be hanging onto this. We maybe get 3 men at a time coming down, and say you put 200 pounds apiece, and you had 600 pounds coming down on this line, helping you take it up. But the only problem was we had one old guy who he's quite a character at the time, old Tom Sorby. Well, Tom, he didn't mind climbing on the lines, but his hands used to get tired hanging onto the rope, so he'd stand on the hands of the guy below him, which didn't help too much because generally it was me.
Many shows used to come to the theaters in Toronto by baggage car. Baggage car was free, evidently, if the train rented the cast a car. The baggage car was free. And the clearers were, we would call them now truck loaders, car loaders. They carried the show in from the horse-drawn vans and laid it on the stage. And then the stagehands took it from there.
In 1921, under orders from the International, Local 58 absorbed the membership of the clearers, Local 488. Work was so plentiful in the 20s that Local 58 appointed its first business agent to handle the distribution of calls. In 1971, when Stanley Peer, Frank Cassidy, and Albert Coster were presented their gold cards for 50 years of service, they recalled Toronto in the 20s as a busy theater town. Big stars like Al Jolson appeared regularly.
The birds are singing, it is song time. The banjo's strumming soft and low. I know that you...
But the good times came to an end as the Depression began in 1930. Vaudeville was dying. Full-length talking pictures were popular and cheaper to present. As times got tougher, no further apprentices were accepted for membership. It was Brother Frank Cassidy's motion that any member with steady work take off 2 days a week to make employment available to members in need. Local 58 survived the Depression with reliable work at the Canadian National Exhibition and by finding new work for its membership in venues like Maple Leaf Gardens and the Art Deco-style Eaton Auditorium, which were built in the midst of the Depression. However, with the outbreak of war, the CNE canceled the grandstand shows, which meant the loss of many jobs. Numerous stagehands answered the call of duty.
I was the electrician with the Army show. It was a touring show. We went across Canada, and then I stayed behind and built the sets that went on to England and across Europe. Well, I returned home and from the Army show, and then got out, and then the union wouldn't take me in. Despite all my political pull with my father and everything, the union kicked me out. Benny Benjamin and I were the first ones after the books got opened up. And they got opened up because they had to take us in. We had jobs that we were holding down full time. And the New York office made them take us in.
With the end of the war, people began to rebuild their lives. A good sign of that was the reopening of the grandstand show at the CNE.
My very first job with Local 58 would have been in 1946, immediately following the end of the Second World War. And it was at the exhibition, in the exhibition grounds Prior to the war, the grandstand shows had been more a big spectacle without real dialogue. But anyway, the format changed to this comedy thing after the war and went on for a number of years like that. And then it became an even bigger thing with Jack Arthur producing shows. With names starred, we had Danny Kaye and Jimmy Durante and people like that headlining the grandstand shows. That was really the biggest activity for Local 58 in terms of manpower every year. One of the largest things would have been the coming of the Metropolitan Opera to the Maple Leaf Gardens.
In fact, in Maple Leaf Gardens, the first thing they had to do was put a grid in. There was no such thing as a grid there.
They worked on doing a different opera each night so that the changeovers were pretty massive there.
And the fly floor was 12 feet off the stage. And we used to get up there and had to let all the lines in, hang all the pipes and things like that in order to get the goods, the electric, and the scenery up for the various operas that were being performed.
The number of men required for the Met Operas was far greater than the membership of the local. The newly elected business agent was Jim Fuller.
I took it over at a time when the Metropolitan Opera was going into Maple Leaf Gardens. Nobody else would take the job, so I took it and I didn't know what I was doing.
Burlesque was another old Toronto tradition. Although tame by today's standards, it was risque stuff for Toronto the Good.
That was working at the Casino Theater on Queen Street, where the Sheraton Center is built right now. For some reason or other, I had to babysit my son, and I brought him down to the theater. I had a funny job down there at the time because it was this here anti-morality, and I had to check all the girls to make sure that they were properly clothed and that there. And my son went home and told his mother that, yeah, Daddy was running around looking at all these here naked women down there.
By the late 50s, the Toronto theater and entertainment scene was stagnant. The once proud Royal Alexandra Theater was often dark for months at a time. Reuben Elliott came to the Royal Alex in August of 1907 and worked there for more than 50 years, with time off to fight 2 world wars. Well, things ain't going too great here these days, but I'm not quitting. I'm 85 and I'm still doing a job. I'm gonna keep right on, too. Reuben Elliott died in 1960, a good IA man, still on the job. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another for Local 58. Metro Toronto needed a modern theater, and big plans were in the works.
Unforgettable too.
Toronto had been a major theater center in the 20s, but by the 1950s, the few surviving buildings were strictly movie houses.
Nate Phillips, the old gray mare.
in his inaugural address, issued a challenge to industry to build a very badly needed entertainment center.
E.P. Taylor put together the financing for the O'Keefe Center.
It took 3 or 4 years to design the building, and it opened on October the 1st, 1960. That was a great occasion because it was Camelot.
Starring Richard Burton, Julie Andrews, and a local boy who made good, Robert Goulet, Camelot was the first Broadway show to try out in Toronto.
We were basically novices back in those days. As far as we were concerned, it was a monstrous show. It was 13 or 14 truckloads. The scenery just seemed to keep coming from New York.
The O'Keefe Center brought Local 58 members into contact with the latest in stagecraft.
And it's at the O'Keefe Center back in, as far as I'm concerned, it was their heyday when there was basically a lineup of musicals to come up from the U.S. and play Toronto. And it was the exposure of those, all those settings and the scenery and the personnel that came with the shows that was very helpful to me in gaining what knowledge I ended up with as far as the scenery, construction, and handling.
The O'Keefe hosted industrials for corporations like Mary Kay Cosmetics and General Motors. Union members built and toured these productions. The O'Keefe Center became home to the National Ballet of Canada and the Canadian Opera Company. Today, the National Ballet and the COC have firmly established their stature in Toronto, across Canada, and around the world. Local 58 is proud to have played a role in their success. The O'Keefe has been renamed the Hummingbird Center, but the history and tradition remain intact. Just when it seemed that the Royal Alexandra Theatre was doomed to fall to the Wreckers' Ball, the most unlikely angel appeared.
When I bought the theater 35 years ago, you know, if I knew anything about theater, I probably wouldn't have touched it. We put in over about $500,000 to restore it, but I felt I had to do that in order to give it a fighting chance. I mean, the touring shows that came from England or United States were often, and they still do, comment on the great backstage crew we have and how the shows go up so efficiently.
There's no people like show people. They smile when they are low. How I wish the folks at home could only see what's come to any, how proud they'd be.
The Alex has also been a producing house. Shows like Hair, Jane Eyre, Rent, and the biggest hit of them all,
Well, Les Mis was one of the great successes, great public acceptance.
I dreamed a dream in time gone by.
But despite all the stars associated with the Alex, there was one man whose dedication to the theater ensures his place in our memory.
No, I have to run this.
Well, Vic Ecclestone was here, and his father worked here before him.
Where?
Vic began his career as a car loader at the Royal Alex and later built scenery for its stock company. He became the theater's master carpenter in 1962 and remained so until his death. In 1993, an interviewer asked Vic to recall a few of the shows he had worked on over his career.
King and I, South Pacific, Guys and Dolls, Kiss Me Kate, Call Me Madam, Brigadoon, Oklahoma. Too many to remember. Too many to remember.
In 1993, David Mirvish, Ed's son, built one of the best new theaters in North America, the Princess of Wales. It was specifically designed to present Miss Saigon.
I think the whole nature of live theater is unpredictable, it's high risk, but I tell you, when theater works, it's more rewarding than anything you can be involved in. And when the people go out with standing ovations, you don't get that from bargains or from roast beef.
For 35 years, one thing has remained constant.
Mr. Mirvish, well, he's one of a kind, and I don't think we'll ever find another one like him. I can only say that he's the finest gentleman I have met ever.
In 1974, Ed Mirvish was given his honorary gold card.
I'm a life member of this Local 58, but I told David that whatever they do, work things out with the union, because if not, I have to hit the bricks.
The all-Canadian production of Cats altered Toronto's theatrical landscape in the 1980s.
As I think back over the years to the Cats experience, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that, and that was really the first big mega musical that came through Toronto, and we were all very much up against the American attitude that we couldn't do it up here.
The scenery for Cats did not come off a truck from New York. It was built at Milligan Scenery by members of Local 58.
And I have to say that every single person involved in that production, the cast, the creative staff, the crew, everybody pulled together and made things happen. And there was such excitement and such pride. And I think that that set the stage for a lot of those shows coming through this city. And I think it's in large part due to the commitment that Local 58 put behind that.
In 1989, a new player came on the scene.
I was very dependent upon the collaborative nature of the industry and the spirit of the people who were working with me at the Pantages Theater back in 1988.
And go, please.
10 years later, the Phantom is still running, and Livent is one of the world's most successful theatrical producers.
Ford Center became our theater for the inauguration of new shows. The complexity of bringing so many new, large, and important shows to the world marketplace was therefore placed on the shoulders of the men and women of IATSE at the Ford Center. And over again, they rose to the occasion.
At the St. Lawrence Center, the Canadian Stage Company has a reputation for high-quality drama and excellent production values. Local 58 takes pride in the dedication and professionalism of the crews of the Bluma Appel Theatre and the Jane Mallett Theatre.
This is a laundry line that gets dumped in the first act. They come and pull it, so it's got trip lines on it. There's some laundry that actually comes off of here independently.
On April the 9th, 1957, a dozen Local 58 men filled a routine call at Maple Leaf Gardens. That day, Elvis Presley played 2 sold-out houses to a screaming, hysterical crowd.
My first rock show was the Beatles. Now, I gotta guess the year 64, 65. And I made a statement there that proved me dead wrong. I still say it. Rock and roll will never last. It's just a passing thing.
By the 80s, arena and stadium rock shows were high-tech extravaganzas. Many occupations, from tinker to chimney sweep, have disappeared over the past century. But the work of a stagehand continues to evolve. Times change, but the challenges of the job remain the same.
And then I thought, because we were coming to the end of the 20th century, it might be a good idea for Local 58 to have a woman in the ranks. And I seemed to be the logical choice. Everybody has a gift. Everybody has certain skills that they bring. And just because I don't have the upper body strength that some guy has, doesn't mean I can't contribute. There are now 10 women in Local 58, either full card or apprentices. And considering it's only 1998, we're making progress.
The work of building Local 58 is constant and demanding. Much is owed to those who have dedicated their lives to the Union.
I suppose when my father became president of the Union, I expect it was around 1938. I was about 5 years old. And so for the next 15 years or so, I was exposed to these telephone conversations every evening when he would get home from work, because there would be theaters calling him, different members calling him, and I would hear one side of the conversations, his side.
The Union people used to fight amongst themselves like a cat and a dog. But the minute they got out together and they were arguing with an employer, my God, you think they were buddies. And then they went around the corner and then they started to fight again.
My grandfather, Jack, was the carpenter at the Royal Alexandra Theatre for 25 years. My dad was the carpenter with the National Ballet for many years. My great-uncle, Al, he also traveled with the ballet, and they've been connected, all of them, in union business. I was the business agent for 9 years, vice president for 12. I've been on the executive board at least 10 years, and as well as looking after the plans of the local. And I hope down the road a lot of the younger members will jump in and look after these plans and the offices. It's very important that we put in the time to look after the local. It's our bread and butter.
The long hours and isolation of a stagehand's work often creates a strain on family life.
Well, I think anybody expecting to live a normal family life in this business is in the wrong trade, because it just can't happen. It's 8 shows a week, 6 evenings and 2 matinees, and you're lucky if you got a Sunday off, and didn't allow much time for a congenial family atmosphere. A lot of the fellas, and I'm one of them, was quite happy to spend my time downtown, and you fall into some pretty strange habits and ways. I was or am, I should say am, because you're never not an alcoholic. I am one. And I haven't had a drink for 30 years, and I found in this business it was sort of an acceptable thing. Drink was around wherever any theater I worked in. It seemed to be a part and parcel of the business, and I was weak and didn't have enough, whatever it takes, to withstand that pressure. It took me a few years to find out that I couldn't go that route and had to stop.
You have to have very special women, who are woman, personally, one, hopefully one-on-one, right? You know, not always, but that gets you into trouble. Not that I know anything about that personally, I've just heard stories, right? But all these years together, I have no qualms, right? Because when times were bad, when I was struggling, all those years, right, she never blinked. But it's a shame to see so many of these young fellows and girls, women, that are going through divorces and trouble and just tearing them apart.
Well, it is certainly a strain on a family with, young children. I know when when we first started, had our children, I would spend weekends alone. During the week was never bad, but weekends were the longest. Your friends had their family at home, so you didn't want to bother them, but it is hard, and with the husband gone so much, it is stressful.
It's very easy to fall into a lot of traps in many jobs, and this job is no different. Late hours, let's go for a drink, that kind of thing. And you have to be aware, you have to watch it, because the partner that you're neglecting is the one that you're going to need support from somewhere along the line, trust me.
Back when we started, there was little or nothing that you would classify as under the control of automation. Everything was basically manually operated. Even the winches which was the start of automation, a form of automation. Now it's all just computer operator and push buttons, and it's highly technical now, and it's a wonderful form of stagecraft. When it is good, it is very, very good, but when it goes bad, it's horrid.
Stan Peer was a member of the local for 50 years before he passed on, and he used to tell me about how he used to do stuff when he was down doing the exhibition back in the 20s now. How he used to do his dimmer work with copper steel rods, shoving them in the brine and that to make his dimmers go down out there. And I thought, well, this is amazing. How come you're still alive today? You haven't electrocuted yourself.
I think it can only help us with our people going out sometimes through the local, sometimes on their own, to go and get training in pyrotechnics, to get training in electrics, to get training as a certified sim operator, which I've done, to get training in operating forklifts, so that we as the local can say, we can supply these people, we can supply certified people. I'm very much a believer in the local being able to supply certified, documented people to do the job.
I think the biggest challenge of being a steward in any building, particularly this building, given the nature of the building itself, is maintaining conditions between the building and the union itself with the contract agreement. There are times when you have to be flexible with that agreement. It's not written in stone, and there are times when people aren't happy with that, whether it be management or whatever. So to try and find a constant compromise is a challenge.
If you want to talk about quality, if you want to talk about expertise, if you want to talk about
operation, direction, supervision, you can't beat the local. I'd rather deal with the local 1,000% than I would rather do it with projects that are done by amateurs. They tend to be more expensive. They're not prepared for the big time.
Occasionally, you know, we lock horns, but that's true in any relationship. God knows a man and a woman in a marriage situation lock horns as well. That's part of the dynamics of working together with people. And I think over the years I've been very fortunate. I've had a lot of really good people to work with, and I feel I have the trust of the local, and I certainly feel that I can trust them in doing what has to be done.
We are constantly professional about the way we do work. We can be counted on. The show always goes on, which is our credo in this business. And I would suggest that when called upon to do anything above and beyond what we're considered to do, we show up.
Doggy dog.
In recent years, non-union contractors have won agreements to service the rock and roll business. The clients don't necessarily save money. In some cases, the non-union bill-out rate is the same as local 58's.
I think the local has bent over, like, you know, to try and accommodate the conditions and the rules that we would have to adapt to get into that facility to try and work with these people. I think that we understand that there is changes in that industry, and I think that we're quite willing to adapt to them.
Yeah, we do all aspects of every job that you can do. You can take from lighting, the sound, the video, we do it all. There are, in the other areas, there are a few professionals, but I don't think that they have the number of people of skilled technicians that we have.
I would like to think we're going to the Air Canada Centre. I'm quite optimistic about that. Over the past few years in Maple Leaf Gardens, we've taken on many other jobs that weren't necessarily fit into our normal criteria jobs.
In the spring of 1963, Jim Fuller was elected president of Local 58.
Out of the tree
Jim Fuller is somebody who I really respect and admire, and not just for what he's done for the local, but for the aura he's created for himself. You don't have to go and explain to anybody in Toronto in Union Theatre or non-Union Theatre who Jim Fuller is. The IA is Jim Fuller, and Jim Fuller is Local 58.
35 years after his election, Brother Fuller is still the president. During his tenure, the local has seen phenomenal growth.
Oh, I don't think I'm a hard nose. I'm just stubborn, that's all. I don't know whether I'm a great negotiator, but if you're stubborn enough and last long enough, then somebody will have to give.
Yes, I think our local has probably the best benefit package I've seen today. In all due thanks, really, to Jim Fuller, Bill Benjamin. They started it all. The Green Shield coverage our members have, to an extent, it is the best.
It seems to me that ever since I became part of the executive of Local 58, many years ago, we've always been fighting. It's a continual fight. It's a fight today for jurisdiction, for better conditions.
In the last years of Reuben Elliott's life, regular poker games were played in theaters around town. A percentage of every hand went to help pay Reuben's rent. He was lucky to have his brothers to stand by him.
I personally have to say that the retirement savings that I was able to put aside in the name of Local 58 for myself has given me a comfortable retirement.
I think if we instill in the newer members a pride, a sense of achievement in being a member of Local 58, then we can well keep what's being given to us over the past 100 years and take that into the next 100 years.
By dawn. Oh, you'll be late for best of the breed.
Truckies at the border won't be here till 1. 3 hours to hang and focus, brothers and sisters under the gun. Whatever it takes, no matter how hard, the job will get done. It comes with the car. He's one for the family, in a brand new century. Carry on, proud tradition. Born in solidarity. Here's a song of celebration to the guts and dedication to the best of the breed. Alone on this empty stage, we sense the brothers of the past, stepping from the shadows into the spotlight at last. 100 years of brotherhood standing side by side.